Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining the Rutgers Geology Museum's Ask a Geologist web series. Today, I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Val Finlayson. She is a postdoctoral associate at the University of Maryland, and she will be talking to us about plumes and plates today. So, without further ado, Val, you can go ahead and present.
Thank you, Ria. Happy to have all of you here today, and I am thrilled to share a little bit of science with you guys today. Slide change there. So today, what we're going to be talking about a little bit is plumes and plates, and these are two slightly different topics, but you'll see by the end of this how they eventually link together in some really interesting ways. So a little bit about me and what I do. Most of the time, I'm an isotope geochemist, and what that means is I specialize in looking at variations in isotopes of certain elements, or elements that have very tiny little differences in their masses because they have a different number of neutrons in their atoms, which we'll revisit again here a little later. And I can measure those tiny little differences, and that tells me things about some of the samples, mainly rocks, that I look at. When I'm not thinking about that kind of stuff, which is honestly most of the time, I spend a lot of time kind of riding and playing with bicycles. And I tend to tinker with some other things too, like some computer programs that I use to help with research, or do sometimes just fun graphical things. I like to paint a little bit, and just kind of have an interest in things that move. So, and when I'm not doing that too, sometimes I even have a little time to get an instrument out and play. So I try to keep all sorts of things in the air. I got my PhD in 2017 from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and that helped springboard me into my current position as a postdoctoral associate over at University of Maryland, where I am researching all sorts of cool things about mantle plumes and their role in the planet. So we have to pick a favorite of something for these, and for that, I decided on volcanoes, but the problem with that is that my favorite volcanoes are constantly changing. But at the moment, two of them are Loihi Seamount, which is one of the youngest volcanoes in the Hawaiian volcanic chain, and Arago Seamount, which is another very young volcano over the end of a different volcanic chain called the Rurutu or Rurutu-Arago track. So the first topic that we're going to start with today are plates, or tectonic plates. What are these? They're pieces of these crystal rock that form large plates on the Earth's surface. And we know about these in several different ways, but this is actually relatively new knowledge for the science, because we didn't know about how the Earth's surface really worked and how tectonics really worked until about the 60s, when a very involved effort to map the bathymetry, or what the seafloor looks like. And two people who are very important in this are in this picture. This is Marie Tharp and Bruce Heezen. And Bruce Heezen did a lot of the shipboard mapping, because when they were doing this kind of research, women were not actually allowed on research ships at the time. So he brought the data back to Marie Tharp, who was a cartographer and had a geological background. And she was able to take this data that they collected with ships about what the seafloor looked like underneath them, and turn them into these incredible maps that revealed a lot of unexpected features about the seafloor. And you can see some of that in some of these maps here. And one of the really notable things that they found are these light colored, in this map, oceanic ridges, which actually, as it turns out, are where new oceanic crust is made. And we can tell that when we look at maps of heat flow in the crust, we can see that these areas in the warmer colors are unusually hot, and that's because this is new, young, hot crust that's being made out of the mantle that these plates sit on top of. We can also detect other continental boundaries. Sorry about that. All right. Through maps of where earthquakes are located around the world. And a lot of earthquakes tend to correlate with plate boundaries where two plates are running into each other, or collisional boundaries. So this is the opposite of what happens at ridges where things are spreading and moving apart. And one of the other fun observations too that we see is that volcanoes tend to correlate also with these convergent boundaries. So these volcanoes is all of us tend to understand them. While volcanism also occurs at these spreading ridges, we don't have as many discrete volcanoes the way that we understand them. So, and also we don't have as much mapping of the seafloor as we would like. Still, even today, 80 years after we started to figure out how the seafloors looked, to really understand how to classify some of these areas, and certainly some undiscovered volcanoes still on the seafloor. So this part of geology has been moving really, really fast, and we've learned a lot about plate tectonics since we confirmed that this was actually how the crust changes over time, and what that tells us about the planet itself. So if we go ahead a little bit, what we know now is that these plates do move, and the surface has looked different in the past, and it will look different in the future. And what you're seeing here, and it may not be super clear on your screens, but there are red arrows and there are blue arrows, and these that we have that kind of map out what plate motion and the direction of the plate motion looks like, and how long this arrow is corresponds to the estimate of how fast we think these plates are moving. So these arrows are vectors, their direction and their speed. And what you'll see is that here the Pacific plate in the center has the largest arrows because it's moving really, really fast, which also corresponds with the really high heat flow that we see along that ridge that runs through the Pacific and into the Indian Ocean. So there's a lot of crust being generated really fast, and at this really fast spreading ridge that also corresponds with fairly fast plate motion in the Pacific. But one of the questions that always kind of bothers us is what exactly is the direction of plate motion of these plates? Because we can determine how two plates move pretty well relative to each other, but we're missing something called an absolute reference frame, which is where there's no motion or anything like that. And we don't know if we have some place that's absolutely still on the crust. So we need to go look for one of those to figure out, okay, do these blue set of arrows look more like what actual plate motion or absolute plate motion looks like, or is it more like these red arrows, or is it slightly different? So that's kind of a neat little active area that that some of us are looking at. So to start to answer that question, we can take a look at the distribution of some younger and some recently active volcanoes around the world. And again, you can see with volcanoes that were recently active in the Holocene but may not be anymore, these blue triangles, they correspond pretty well with the red volcanoes, which are volcanoes that we have known to be active recently, and in this case, since 1900. And these correspond with a lot of plate boundaries, but there are a few exceptions to that. So as an example, we have a few places here, like over in Hawaii, off the coast of South America, where you have Easter Island and a couple of other unusual so-called intraplate volcanoes. And down here in the Southern Pacific, we see these volcanoes that aren't associated with any sort of plate boundary. So they don't look like these boundaries that ring, if you will, the Pacific, or some of these other spots where we might have oceanic crust being generated through these kinds of processes. So what are these? And around the same time that we were really starting to figure out how plate tectonics worked in the 60s, there was a researcher called Tuzo Wilson who proposed and another man named Jason Morgan, excuse me. They were taking a closer look at the Hawaiian archipelago, which is this group of volcanic islands here. And between the two of them, there ended up becoming this idea that there are these mantle plumes, or these columns of hot rock that rise from deep within the earth. And they may cool under the upper mantle, where there's a little bit of melt that occurs that is then sampled by volcanoes that erupt on the surface. And it's thought that these may not move with the plate because they occur from much further down, and that these structures might not be as mobile. That's still a question that we have to answer. Is you have all these surfaces, all these plates moving up at Earth's surface, but we're still trying to find that absolute reference, which might be these plumes. So how this model seems to work is that you have this rising hot rock, sort of like a lava lamp, and then it erupts these volcanoes on the surface, and then as the plate moves over them, you generate new volcanoes that are sequentially younger down the line of this chain. So you have an active volcano, and the volcano that's the furthest away is probably the oldest. And we see that actually hotspot tracks, or as we like to call them, are fairly common, and we find a lot of them in ocean basins like the Pacific, and there are a few in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean too. But I'm going to focus mainly on the Pacific because that's where I do a lot of research. And these circles here all represent places where we know that there are really young active volcanoes, and Hawaii is, of course, the most famous example. And when you trace Hawaii back, you know about the islands here, but what you may not know is that there are a bunch of volcanoes that are underwater that have been long extinct, and they go for a very long time, forming this very long chain backwards in time into the Pacific plate and up to the north. And we see that some other similar chains have some long records. So Louisville is another famous example where we can follow these volcanoes back in time for tens of millions of years. And this was recognized pretty early on, but trying to figure out a very complex area in this part of the Pacific has been a very active area of research. So one place where I've done some work is with this one called Rurutu, or sometimes Rurutu Arago. And this is a particularly interesting hotspot that runs through here and forms a very old chain. So when we went out to go sample part of this hotspot track to understand more about it and try to trace it through time across the sea floor, a bunch of us got on a research ship and we went to part of the track that hadn't been sampled by anybody before. So this is the first time anybody's tried this. And we went and we put down these bags made out of chains, and we dragged them across parts of the volcanoes to try to catch some rocks, which is what we have here. This was a particularly fun day where all of us were really excited about these really amazing rocks that we pulled up. So we had to go get a picture. That's me with a very, very large, very heavy rock there back in 2013. And when we cut these rocks open using a saw, sometimes we found some really interesting stuff too that we didn't expect. So this rock here is actually 60 million years old. One of my friends went and got an age date on it. And what he discovered is that it does fit with the age that we thought it might be, but we had the surprise of these little black shards here, which are actually volcanic glass or obsidian. And normally, volcanic glass doesn't usually last that long. It tends to turn into sort of a mud or a clay really quickly. So we were surprised to see these very fresh pieces of glass inside of some of these rocks that ended up being 60 million years old. And that gave us some really interesting, unexpected information about this about these rocks. And then, of course, sometimes you end up with a few extras, more than you are able to store. So once we got over a part of the abyssal plain in the ocean where there were no volcanoes, no chance of anybody ever picking up these rocks again, sometimes you get to go and roll them over the side. You have to be very careful when you do this, though, because if some future geologist came through and sampled that rock, that could really screw up their interpretations. When you're out at sea, you have to be extremely careful with all of this, but it's so much fun for all of the science and all of the cool rocks that you get to go see. So as far as how everything starts to link together here, this is where my work kind of comes into play. So as I said, I'm an isotope geochemist, and I focus on these variations in these very tiny little mass differences in some elements. So here I'm showing some data from a paper we just submitted on the Rurutu-Arago hotspot track, where I'm showing some lead isotope data and some neodymium isotope data. And these little numbers up here at the top, the 206 lead and the 204 lead, the 143 neodymium and the 144 neodymium, tell us the mass of that particular isotope within that element. And the 204 lead and the 144 neodymium don't really change with time because they aren't altered by processes or the radioactive decay of another element that is capable of making lead or neodymium. So we can use that as a way to look at how some of the other elements that can be affected by, in this case, radioactive decay of a uranium isotope and radioactive decay of an element called samarium changes the amounts of 143 neodymium and 206 lead with time. And what we find is that we were able to trace the Rurutu-Arago hotspot track from its active point at Arago Seamount, currently one of my favorite volcanoes, all the way back in time and across a large portion of the Pacific seafloor to some of these islands back here that are 120 million years old in some cases, because this hotspot track has a really distinctive chemistry that we don't see really anywhere else. There are other things that might look a little bit like it, but it's this very unique thing. And that's part of the reason that these plumes are also really interesting, is they have some really interesting chemistry that is kind of rare compared to places, things like the oceanic crust that you see here. One of the unexpected things that we found is that this plume actually seems to have two different compositions on two different sides of it, which is what we're showing in this figure, where you have stuff with a different looking neodymium and slightly different looking lead composition on one side, and then on the other, sometimes we see a slightly different but still related composition. So we think that this is telling us something about what's going on further down in the Earth where these plumes came from. And having this track of this kind of record as the plate moves over it is really valuable information, and it helps us understand how the planet works and cycles and changes over time. Another thing that we can do, and what one of my friends did a couple of years ago, also with the Rurutu-Arago track, the Hawaiian Emperor track, and the Louisville track, is that these are three very long volcanic chains that people have traced over time over the last 30, 40, possibly more years. And we have, we know how old volcanoes are along different parts of all of these tracks. So we can say, okay, we can compare how far apart all of these different hotspots were from each other throughout time. And distances between these hotspots, if they change over time, will tell us, okay, these hotspots were moving around inside the mantle plumes that feed them. And that's a very important thing, because this helps us start figuring out, okay, which one of these may have moved over time, have one of these maybe stayed still, which kind of answers the question about how can we really get a good handle on how plate tectonics works. So this is one of the things that we're trying to better understand that. And what it looks like is that Rutu and Louisville might not have changed their distance a whole lot, maybe only a few hundred kilometers difference over time. Whereas when you compare them to Hawaii, Hawaii looks like it's changed a lot in its distance between these two hotspots. So that one probably moved while it was making this really old part of the chain here, which is really cool. This tells us a lot about how the Hawaiian Emperor chain and the plume feeding it has changed a lot over time too. So there's still a lot left to do there. And between this combination of chemistry and understanding how things move over time, and also some earthquake data, is when earthquakes happen, they don't just travel across the surface; they also go through the earth. And as they hit different kinds of material, they can move. Those waves can move faster or slower, or they might move at a different angle. That tells us something too. So we need all of this very, very different information: the earthquakes, the chemistry, understanding this movement, to try to get an idea of what the inside of the Earth looks like. So we're taking all of these surface observations that we can see and trying to look into the planet where we can't, directly see it. We can't even we can't even drill a hole into the crust below the mantle yet either. So what we see are some really interesting structures here in the red and the blue. And the blue seem to be these areas, these structures that might be colder, where seismic waves travel faster. And some of those are where we're losing pieces of oceanic crust as they sink below the plates that they run into at these convergent boundaries, where all the volcanoes and all of the earthquakes happen. And then you have these upwelling areas in red, and some of those are going to be plumes. Some of those are where you might have hotter or denser material, and some of it's going to move upwards. And what we think we're seeing is a snapshot of what is circulating and convecting inside the planet. Let's try to move on here. So why do we care? And that's a really good question. There are a few reasons for that. Some of it is really just pure science and just the curiosity of understanding how this works. So if we know how plate tectonics works, this helps us know a little bit, not just where things were back in time or where they might go, but this also helps us understand why we get earthquakes and volcanoes where we do. It helps us better understand the risks that those can pose to people who live near these places. And that's a really important thing, is understanding the hazards to people, because we want to keep them as safe as possible. So some of the fundamental questions that I'm after can really help some of the more human side of science, where we do really, really care about keeping people safe and having people understand these risks as much as possible. It also helps us understand how these plumes work over time, because we can't see these plumes, and we can't see how they looked prior to what we know about the inside of the Earth now. So we're trying to learn as much as possible about where these come from and what structures deep in the mantle they might be related to, and try to understand how this unusual kind of volcanism works in the planet, which also, again, helps with plate tectonics questions. Some of these plumes, too, also produce volcanoes and sometimes stuff that never erupts but melts inside crustal systems that bring up metals that are really important for humans. So things like rare earth metals are very interesting, and we look for those in some of these systems because that's what keeps our cell phones working and our computers and a lot of our other tech. It also can be a source for things like helium, and that helps us run scientific equipment, and it helps us shoot rockets into space. And it also makes your voice sound pretty funny if you inhale a helium balloon. And kind of the bigger question of this too, possibly the more philosophical one, is how does a planet work? Particularly planets that, as we understand them, are habitable. So Earth-like planets that have liquid water and an oxygenated atmosphere, and questions like that. So kind of where we are with the science and how plumes and plates interact and what they tell us about plate tectonics is kind of cool. So you may notice when you look at a map of the Earth that a lot of the continents seem to fit together like a puzzle, and that was something that a guy named Wegener noticed and proposed as the idea of continental drift back in the early 1900s. And the idea was kind of not really widely accepted at the time because there wasn't really a good mechanism that there wasn't a good way to explain it at the time because we didn't understand what was going on beneath the crust at that point. So when we started discovering mid-ocean ridges in the 60s, thanks to Tharp and Thiessen, it started to make a lot more sense when we started to understand that there's more than just continents that kind of move around and bump into each other over time. What we also see is that the oceanic part of the crust is really involved with this and a very important part of this as well. And when we put all this information together, we can actually get a pretty good idea of what happened from a plate tectonic standpoint with the breakup of Pangaea, which I'm showing here, which is our last supercontinent, and why it looks like these puzzle piece continents may have linked together at one time. That's because they probably did. So you can see here, you have North America and Europe that first rifted apart, and then you have South America and Africa that rifted apart too. But at one point, they were all one giant continent and all connected to each other. It's pretty amazing. So what does this look like on the inside of the Earth? And that's another really active area of research and something that we're trying to get at by putting what we know about the compositions of things that volcanoes and belts that we think have come from inside the Earth in Earth's mantle here, and what we know about plate tectonics and what we know from seismic or earthquake data, and we try to make numerical models that show how the inside of the Earth changes over time. And you can make these simulations. So this is a simple example where you have the crust on the outside. This is the core, and then this is the Earth's mantle. And this is a convecting solid, by the way. This is not liquid. So what we have are downwelling zones where you would have crust probably being recycled back into the Earth. And you can see where some of this material may have ponded at the core mantle boundary, and some of it might be getting recycled in these upwelling areas where you're getting mantle pools. And some of this may circle back around and be recycled back down. So you see it just kind of forms this big cyclic process. And we're trying to understand how all of these link together. And it looks like once we look beyond the surface, the Earth is this incredibly complex, very dynamic place, and it's changed a lot since it first formed 4.5 billion years ago. So what's next? That's another very loaded set of questions, and it's the kind of stuff that I think keeps a lot of us who do this kind of research really excited about what we do. Because we really are trying to get at understanding how the planet works as this big, complicated system, and we're constantly making improvements to try to understand that. Since we can't just go cut the planet open like is shown here. If we did that, we'd be in trouble. We also need to know how. We also want to know how the Earth formed and changed over time, and how the conditions formed that allow it to support life at its surface. And one of the kind of really far-reaching things too, and something that always kind of interests me and probably a lot of other people, is this something that, are these conditions or are these materials? Is this something that we can look for elsewhere in the universe and try to look for another solar system where there might be life that we can kind of beam a message to and say, hi, you're not the only ones out there. So, that's kind of a fun thing to think about. And I'll leave that part of the science to somebody else. But I think trying to really get to really understand the planet that we're part of is a really important thing to do, because it helps us answer a lot of questions that are directly relevant to humanity. It also lets us answer some questions about ourselves. So with that, I think I will wrap up this presentation and I will take some questions. Thank you. All right, I'm just pulling up chat here. It looks like we have a lot of questions here. One moment, folks. Okay, so the first question I have here that was submitted is from Bill Burns, who wants to know, is there a published list anywhere of all known plumes or hotspots on Earth? Bill, there are a couple. This is a great question. There's one by Don Anderson, I believe published in the year 2000, called The Complete Hotspot Catalog. That's something you can Google for, and I think it may be publicly accessible, but you might want to get in touch with one of us if you had some trouble finding it. I have a PDF copy of that somewhere that I can send along. Let's see. There's also some newer literature that might be a little harder to get to that tries to test some of these hotspot locations and tries to look for seismic evidence of a mantle plume underneath the hotspots, because mantle plumes aren't necessarily the only thing that drives the so-called intraplate volcanism. Sometimes there's some other explanations too that are related to more shallow processes where there's some weird crustal structure, crustal dynamics occurring. One of those papers is by Dapeng Zhao in 2007 in the Journal of Botswana Research, where he does a seismic survey of 60 different hotspot locations to look for plumes, and that's a pretty interesting paper. So yeah, there are a few different resources out there where people are cataloging and trying to identify the sources of some of these interesting, strange volcanoes. Why are Loihi and Arago your favorite volcanoes? This is another good question. At the moment, it has a lot to do with their composition, and also because it's fresh rock, which is way easier to work with in the lab, with really, really young lavas. Loihi is, in some ways, its own very unique composition in the Hawaiian Islands. It has some interesting isotope compositions that seem to tell us that it's coming from a part of the mantle that is really, really old, or at least has preserved some really, really old characteristics from when the Earth was very, very young and looked different. Arago may do some of the same thing, and that's but it's less well studied. So hopefully, I'm hoping someday to get to work a little more specifically on Arago seamount. So far, with that Hoover-2 Arago hotspot track, I've focused on the older volcanoes. The next question is: do you always expect to find volcanoes near subduction zones? You can find them often near subduction zones. That's a good place to start looking. But again, you have those intraplate areas where the volcanoes are sourced by some other process than two plates running into each other. And then you can have some volcanism that occurs at spreading centers too. So one place where you can look for where you have spreading occurring on land instead of on the oceans, which is what I focused on today, is in the Rio Grande Rift in the southwestern United States. You'll see some volcanoes around there now and again. Those are some interesting places to study. All right, how old is the ocean floor? That depends a lot on where you look. So some of the oldest ocean floor is, I don't remember exactly how old. It's at least 200 million years old in one tiny little triangular shaped area in the Western Pacific. But over at the ridges, that stuff was made very recently. So, within the last few hundreds or tens of thousands of years at the ridges. And as you move away from the ridges, the age of the ocean floor gets progressively older. So what did we learn from the glass in our samples? So I wasn't a major participant in this study, so I can't really summarize it very well, but we were able to look at some very unique gas data. So volcanic lava is actually very gassy, which sounds pretty funny, and it can be. Volcanoes are definitely pretty smelly. And sometimes with this glass, one of the advantages of it is that it can trap these gases. And if the glass stays in good shape, the gas doesn't really go anywhere. The gas tends to be lost once the glass starts altering over to clay or other things. So we were able to get some information about what these gases looked like in the particular source composition, what the this particular type of mantle plume that we think is where the Rurutu hotspot track came from. And that hasn't really been done before. We haven't had glass that is from that kind of composition. So it was really exciting stuff. And that can tell us a little bit about sometimes the age of the reservoir. Sometimes it can tell us about if it's really, if it's been significantly changed over time by some of those recycling processes that I showed. And yeah, there are all sorts of ways to use it. And I'm sorry, I wish I could go into more detail, but I just don't know that answer too well. Let's see, this question. Ria's mom would like to know, since volcanoes emit sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide gases, how safe is it for people who live on them, like the Big Island? So kind of like the previous question, yeah, sulfur dioxide is one of the big concerns when a volcano is erupting. Carbon dioxide is emitted, but we worry a little bit about less about that because the overall contribution of carbon dioxide to the atmospheric system from volcanoes is relatively small, especially compared to how much humans emit. And no, I don't have the numbers for that off the top of my head, but sulfur dioxide is a definite concern because, and other types of sulfur gases, because it can really mess with your breathing. And I lived in Hawaii during the 2018 eruption over on the island of Oahu, and we were getting some sulfur dioxide as far away as there, and it was causing some breathing problems and some asthma for some people. And there were a lot of people on the Big Island that actually had to wear those full-face respirators with special sulfur filters because it was just so irritating and so strong and so smelly as that thing was erupting. So it was safe for a lot of these people, but it also depended a little bit on what direction the wind blew on any given day, and you did have to sometimes take extra measures or sometimes just go somewhere else for the day to avoid some of the fumes. So it was something all of us kept a very close eye on when the eruptions occurring. I hope that answers the question. Question about hotspots. Can they ever change the direction that they are moving in? Yes, we see that with Hawaii a little bit. Some of the research and some papers that I didn't talk about during the talk have all shown that the Hawaiian hotspot at one point in its history moved downward really fast, and then we think it kind of stopped moving. But we have a really good idea of how far it's moved north and south because sometimes there are certain minerals in these lavas that can align with the Earth's magnetic field, and we can use that to look at how to look at how that alignment has changed over time. So we can track that, but we don't know how they've moved side to side because the magnetic data doesn't. It only tells us north and south. We can't really do east and west very well with that. So we think that some of these plumes and these hotspots have moved a little bit side to side too. Yes, and how much or if they've changed direction, we don't know super well, but we think that they do change direction over time. I will also say, as a quick side answer to that, when we look at some of the numerical models that look at plumes, we can see them kind of wave around in the simulated mantle too. So there is some evidence that they do change direction from that as well. But that again is only a model, so we're still learning. The next question is it true that someday Hawaii will be next to Japan and Los Angeles will be next to San Francisco? Um, Generally, I think so. San Francisco, at least parts of it, are slowly moving up the coast because that's a type of fault called a transform fault that moves side to side, and it's moving in bits of San Francisco. I think this way it's easier for you guys to see. It's moving north as the Pacific plate moves. Part of the Pacific Ocean basin over there, and it's not actually the Pacific plate there. It's moving north, so yeah, it will. Or not San Francisco. Sorry, I'm getting my locations screwy. Let me clarify. Los Angeles and San Francisco, pieces of them are both moving north. So yeah, bits of them may eventually be next to each other someday. Yes. Hawaii someday might be might be near Japan, depending on if there is an eventual convergence of where the Hawaiian hotspot is, and if the Eurasian plate keeps moving toward the plate. We don't know what will happen that much further in the future. We don't know if maybe something's going to happen in the Atlantic that will change how the Pacific behaves, but it's a possibility that that could happen. I don't have a good answer for if that's a definite yes or no, though. Did I find any metals or useful resources that people could source from volcanoes? Me personally, I haven't, but I have been to a couple of mines, and you sometimes find some interesting things like pyrite, also known as fool's gold, in some of the deposits where people have dug. It's not something that I spend a whole lot of time looking at, but I kind of have fun when I get a chance to go out into the field and visit those kinds of places. There are other people who are much better at that kind of side of the volcano science than I am. Are there any hot spots on land like Yellowstone? Yes. I didn't focus on those too much since my talk was mainly about the Pacific today. So if you look over on the other side of the planet, we have another cluster of these hotspots that sit off the coast of Africa, and some of them sit underneath Africa. And that's another really cool spot. And actually, a really good friend of mine works on the African side of things, and he works on some hotspots that occur underneath Africa, and you see that they also form some hotspot tracks there, kind of like you think may have happened with Yellowstone over time. And you can see these little chains of volcanoes, and the ages change systematically with some of them. In other places, they might be helping break Africa, the African continent, into a couple of different pieces. Why are most hotspots in the middle of oceanic plates? This is a very good question. So it's a little bit chance that this happened. So one of the big hypotheses that we work with is that hotspots that are fed by mantle plumes might be coming from this place just above the core mantle boundary, where we have these continent-sized seismic anomalies. So they look very strange in the earthquake data, and it looks like some of these plumes come from the edges of these provinces. And one of those provinces sits underneath the Pacific, There's another one that sits underneath Africa and part of the Atlantic, and actually a bit of it sits underneath Iceland as well. So we think Iceland comes from a plume too. It's just chance. I'm happening it the way I constructed this talk makes it look like it's mostly under oceans, and in this case, it's more of the ocean happens to be sitting on top of that particular anomaly in the Pacific right now. What happens to the oceanic crust in the Atlantic Ocean as it moves away from the mid-Atlantic ridge? That is kind of a complicated question. It starts interacting a little bit with some of the water. It gets altered a little bit. It definitely gets older, just like all of us do. It can crack, but mostly it does just kind of hang out. It kind of gets a lot of water absorbed into it. I don't know a ton more about this. I wish I could point you towards some more resources for that one. Let's see. How long does it take for a plume to reach the surface? That's another good question. We're not totally sure, but we think it takes somewhere on the order of 10 million years, according to some of the modeling that some of the geodynamics community has done. It looks like that's a pretty decent estimate. It's pretty slow. So where on Earth would I go to study plumes if I could go anywhere? Where would I go? I'd probably go back to the South Pacific. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on there that isn't super well studied yet, and I really like working on areas where we have some of those really unanswered questions. Sometimes some people really like building great things on top of what we already know really well. Some of us like to explore and try to test out some new ideas in locations we don't know as well, and I tend to be one of those. Both of those types are super valuable scientists to have, but I just happen to be a bit of an explorer, I think. Is there evidence of plumes on other planets? Yes, we think we might see them on the surface of Venus, and they're called, I believe, coronae, but I don't know a whole lot beyond that. There might, some people have also talked about the possibility that it's the Tharsis province on Mars might have come from a giant plume, but again, that's not something that we really know a whole lot about. So there's more than one potential explanation for that. So question of why did I go into geology? I kind of found it late as an undergraduate. I was already more than 3 years into my undergraduate degree, and I was already working on an earth science topic. But I had the opportunity to go out in the field and really kind of just get covered in dirt and pick up rocks and be able to learn how to kind of speak the language of the rocks and figure out the stories that they tell. And there's something that got me really hooked on that, especially with volcanic rocks. And then one thing kind of led to another. And as I got more and more into volcanic rocks, I got into the chemistry of them. And then I kind of fell into the isotopes and worked really hard at it. And I think I got into it because it helps me understand the environment around me. And I kept going in it because the more I learned, the more I wanted to know, and the more I realized that there's a lot that we still have left to learn. What is the favorite place you've visited in your studies? Kind of been all over the place. And there are a lot of amazing places to go on this planet. I love going to sea, but you can't always directly see the thing that you're sampling too, because sometimes it's several kilometers below the keel of your ship. So you can see it in the bathymetry and the data that we get back, the rocks that we bring up, but you can't always just go and walk around and map it. So I like going to places like New Zealand where you have volcanoes that you can figure out. Okay, I'm being told that we need to wrap things up. So the last question I'm going to get to, and I'm sorry I can't get to all of them, but will new plumes form in the future? Where might they form? That's a good question that we don't really have an answer to. That's Stay tuned. I'm actually working on a project that I'm just starting right now that hopes to answer some of that. So maybe in about 2 years, we might know a little bit more about where some future plumes might be. They might come from the same places. They might come from places that aren't currently making plumes. So we'll figure it out. I promise. All right. I think at this point, I have to stop taking questions, and we'll get this wrapped up. Thank you so much for attending this.
Okay, thank you so much, Val. That was very interesting. And thank you for everyone who joined us today. So our next series will be on Friday, July 10th at 2 p.m. And we will have Dr. Don Monteverde, who is an adjunct professor at Rutgers in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And he will be talking to us about geologic maps. So that's on July 10th at 2 p.m. And once again, Val, thank you so much for doing this. That was really interesting. Enjoy the rest of your day.